This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website builder that gives you the power to create your own personalized website to showcase and sell your artwork.
Before we begin this video, I do feel like I owe some of you an explanation. In December for 12 Days of Proko, I did a video called The Reference Sandwich. And the idea of that was, let's say, a mature way of using reference to maximize your artistic potential. And one idea I had in that was that you really have to respect nature. And I gave the example of King Canute from mythology who didn't respect nature and paid the price. And some of you had a very valid concern, which is what I want to address. And that concern was something like, oh my God, actually, no, that's not how the legend goes. He actually wasn't ignorant and he was merely demonstrating to his courtiers that he was not more powerful than God, and it went on and on. It potentially gives the appearance that I am the sort of person who would rather buy a crown and cape and go strutting around the beach than do 5 minutes of research on Wikipedia. And that's definitely not the case. Look, what you were supposed to observe was that I was demonstrating to you what happens if you don't use reference. I deliberately didn't know anything about that story before I did it, to show you how the artistic product is weaker if you do that.
It was just so sophisticated.
It just wasn't.
But look, I know I was just expecting to meet you on a level here, and that's, there's maybe not quite where you're at. So in this video, we're going to continue exploring this idea of the reference sandwich, and I'm gonna meet you more at your level. So I'll be doing a sculpt of a female figure. That is to say, I'll be sculpting boobs. Because that's what you like, isn't it? Boobs. Oh God. Boobs or no boobs. For me, the takeaway from this whole process, and the reason why it's worth the time to think about and to explore for yourself, is that where the magic happens is in a space between the artist and between nature, and it's about getting comfortable navigating that space. And when you are, the style doesn't matter and the subject doesn't matter. So honestly, for me, the way that I handle a bike-headed blob frog called Philip and the way I handle a naked woman, it's pretty much the same. That's probably why I never had any luck with women. Anyway, get on with the demonstration. Okay, I'm going to start this demonstration with a study from a 3D scan taken from 3D Scan Store. So to start with, I don't know what it is that I'm going to sculpt, so I'm just allowing the reference to be my guide. Within Sculpture, I identify this process as creating a canvas, basically just figuring out my main movements, my main forms. And as I'm doing this, I'm using techniques that as a student, I would use much more carefully, much more laboriously maybe. So for example, I might be looking at clear landmarks like the corner points of the hips there, the two aces bones, and then pulling a vertical up from those and seeing what do they line up with, or a horizontal. So here, a vertical from her left aces pretty much lines up with the hand as it escapes the body here. And then this one just about misses the elbow from the front view. So using verticals, using horizontals, all of this stuff is all part and parcel of what you will train yourself to do if you are training yourself to work accurately from the model, putting in the main landmarks like the belly button here. It's not being added because the belly button itself is of a huge amount of interest to us, but it helps me check, like, so here, for example, the belly button seems maybe the right height above those aces bones there, but that distance between the belly button and the elbow seems very, very long. So that tells me that probably this whole distance is getting too long. So this process, and it's the same whether you're sculpting or drawing, at least if you are drawing in an academic style, is that there is a battle to add in as much information as you can, but not too much information. As soon as you add in too much information, you get overloaded and then you lose control. But if you don't have enough information there, you can't begin to make decisions. Here, putting in the center line, I might mark in where the scapulars are, for example. But if I start to put in each one of those individual ribs, I may find myself with too much information and may find that I'm starting to lose control. So you can see with the blocking that I've done, I'm instinctively exaggerating that C curve through there. When I say instinct, that's maybe not the right word because it's a trained style, let's say. It's not an academic style, but it's something that I do in my work when I'm looking to identify the main movement, the main character, the main personality, and then I'll look to push that. But what will probably happen is the more that I refine the forms, the more I'll start to subdue that and to limit the movement of it. And that's when my reference is going to start to become a trap. So that's why at some point I'll probably have to consciously discard it. From the side view, you can see I actually haven't instinctively hit the angle as strong as it can be. Most of the time you don't, unless you've trained yourself well to do it, or unless you have very, very good instincts. Maybe that belly button is too low. As I'm working from the model, I'm consciously thinking, how do I capture whatever it is that I want to capture? The movement, the proportions, the anatomy, whatever it might be, I might be consciously thinking about that. But I notice that this whole time, when I'm looking at the model and looking at my sculpt, I'm not really thinking about what I want the sculpt to be. And so this is the thing, right? Already this pull is taking into effect. Like I'm not thinking about necessarily the composition of the sculpt because I'm just thinking about her. So I will continue working on this for a little while more, and then it'll be time to say bye-bye for a little bit. And that is the point when I can just really get some air and really figure out what I want the sculpt to be. I mean, for example, if you're doing a torso study, then having one arm come across the body like this, it's a difficult thing to pull off compositionally. It can look a bit alien, a bit intrusive. So let's see what I'm going to do with that. But for now, going back, for example, checking the angle of the shoulders, all of these things that we are trained to do, checking the angle of the hips, all of that stuff, this is where my reference becomes super useful. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. You see how this is my acis, this is my pieces? You see how those things are getting absolutely completely detached from each other? How that form is completely broken? If we look at it on her, you can mark the movement of the hips much more easily. Well, this is something that I can figure out either by looking at reference or by just looking at my sculpt and seeing anatomically, is that a possible thing? Could that have even worked? And a lot of the time, when you're working from reference, you won't necessarily be considering these anatomical nuances because you're just abstracting the form. You're just thinking about it as movements and angles and all of that stuff. And you can miss like these most obvious things where it's like, well, those could not possibly be human hips. So in this case, I happen to have caught it whilst working with the reference, but it's that kind of thing that I will often miss. And then when I throw my reference away, suddenly it's like the most obvious thing in the world. Now, here's another thing. You see the strength of her sternocleidomastoids here. I find it kind of weird, to be honest. I can believe it, but it's such a strong and decisive movement. If I'm cropping the sculpt here, to have something so overpowering in its sharpness around here, I wonder whether that's going to do me any favors. So as I'm doing that, I'm consciously reducing it. But again, that's another example of something that I might get pulled into just blindly copying as I'm working from the model. Okay, let's step back and just focus on the accuracy a little bit more. In sculpture, it's really important that these forms make sense in 3 dimensions. We have less room for cheating in 3D, I believe, than we do in 2D, because there's no room for suggestion. Everything exists somewhere in space. So you see how the crunch there, so strong, that bong, that angle there to that angle there. You see how I'm underplaying that through there? This is the same as I was mentioning before. This is just so common that even with the reference right in front of us, we will generally be tempted to play things safe. Not all of us, but from what I've observed, most of us. Generally, our lines will tend a little bit too much to the vertical, a little bit too much to the horizontal. Our forms will repeat themselves a little bit too obviously. One thing as I'm working from reference is I will be doing quite a lot of note taking. So the idea of taking a note is, well, exactly as it sounds. You're just marking something in so that then when you're working on it separately from the model, you can kind of go, okay, yeah, that's what that note was for. So for example, like the notes that I made through there, you see these two movements here, that's the cartilage at the bottom of her rib cage. And then here, that's obliques on top of the ribs going up to meet the serratus. Or it could be ribs. The angle suggests that it's ribs actually. Okay, so anyway, point is that the note that I'm making is just to go, okay, there is stuff there. Now I can take that stuff diligently from reference, or I can start to involve my own taste, my own imagination. But the point of taking the note is to say, this thing exists and I consciously want to take that, because this is where the rib cage is pushing out, right? So that's where it's important. And then on this side, we certainly wouldn't want to find the movement of ribs because everything is compressed down here and the rib cage isn't pushing out. So these movements down here become much looser, much more rounded. Let's say that I'm happy. Let's say that this is as much as I'm going to take from reference for now. So then at this point, I can go like, okay, time to discard that, and now start to figure out what it is that I want. And I would, take a break, have a coffee, do whatever now to be looking at this in a fresh eye, in a new light with a fresh eye, and to go, what is the composition that I want? For example, I'm interested in how this rib cage is pushing out here. The strength of this break, which I was missing before, I really think that I can take that and I can push that. And I'm wondering, like, how far can I push all of this before it starts to break? Can I really swing this around? And maybe I don't want that arm going across the body at all. Maybe my sculpture will make much more sense without that. I don't know, but I'm going to try it. Of course, as I'm working this stuff out, I have to rely on my visual library. Right? I have to rely on my understanding of the anatomy of the form if I'm going to put in something representing breasts, or I would have to go in and find other reference to supplement that. But even if you don't have a strong visual library at this point, I would be putting stuff in, not going back to reference, because then of course you fall straight back into the trap from before, and just going, what is it that you want this thing to be? Since we're doing a figure here, it's obviously very, very useful to know the anatomy. So here, I'm thinking about what it is that I want to describe. So in this case, the latissimus getting so stretched up, the scapula pushing out, swinging out away from the body. This arm, this is potentially going to be problematic because I'm changing it so much from what it was in the reference. So it was pushing forwards. Maybe we even pull it back here. So all the decisions that I'm making now, some of which I share with you through the medium of my mouth, some of which I don't. Some of them are just in my head, instinctive, as I forget to open my mouth as I'm doing them. But, for example, here, I'm kind of going, yeah, how much of a swing out can I get there? How straight can I pull that? To what extent can I push it before it breaks completely? I'm wondering, composition-wise, whether like this up and down could be countered by an opposing up and down through that way. So in this way, I start to build in a little bit more of that leg. For me, this is the most exciting stage, because I start to make this thing into a whatever it is, something that is its own thing that hasn't existed before, but it would never have existed without the reference as a starting point. And I find that kind of that meeting point between myself and the reference to be really exciting thing, really rewarding thing to explore. So there is a key difference in the way that I'm thinking now to how I was thinking when working from reference. And I'm thinking now much more about story. So for example, here, what I'm looking to do is not to make it accurate. I do have a vague recollection of how it was in the reference. I think there were multiple wrinkles through here that didn't reach out towards the front. But because I'm pushing that compression so much more, I'm allowing those wrinkles to push round more towards the front. But the big thing that I'm wanting to sell here is the idea of compression. And then on the other side, the idea of extension. I've lost my notes here that I took of, I remember we could feel the cartilage pushing out here. and that was feeding through into the ribs that were like a separate form through there, and I'm consciously looking for that because that will help me tell the story of the extension that's happening here. So not all forms are equally important. The forms that help me tell the story of the muscle getting pulled tight through here, or the bone pushing out onto the surface, those are much more useful forms to me because they describe the thing that I want to describe. They describe what's happening here with the model. So basically I don't have any other distraction at this point other than thinking about what is the thing that I'm making and how do I tell that story. The problem is at some point I'm gonna get stuck because I'm gonna go, what is the thing that I'm making? Well, it's this, the extension is here, the compression is there, there's this contrast of movements in the composition, whatever it is. And then I go, okay, and how do I tell that story? And I go, I don't know. I don't know the pose well enough. I don't know the anatomy well enough. I don't know, whatever it is, whatever it might be. And that's when I pick up the reference phone and go, help. And so that is essentially the backwards and forwards in a nutshell. Of course, the more you study the anatomy, the longer you can hold off making that call and the more free that you can be in your decisions. A lot of time when it comes to studying anatomy, people are unsure kind of why they're studying it. They just know that they should. They're not 100% sure why. And there's a belief that, well, I'm going to study it and it's going to make my work better. And no, there isn't a direct connection like that. You don't necessarily need to know anatomy. But when it comes to something like this, when it comes to telling your stories with freedom, then suddenly you realize the power of it. Because here, what I'm not thinking about necessarily is accuracy. I'm thinking about story. By the way, here, I'm looking to just see what happens if I compress my sculpt. Because if I do, that big C curve suddenly becomes much more dynamic. I end up with a less elongated sculpt, and elongated sculpts are obviously nice for very elegant movements. The more compressed your lines become, whether that's sculpture or drawing, the quicker the movements become, so it becomes dynamic, but you sacrifice elegant movement, something like that. But I'm conscious, it's still stored in my head that, the pose in the reference had that big C curve, and I did like it, and I still feel like I want to take something from it. As I'm going to the 3/4 view, I can see how distorted my forms are becoming. So this is where I might take some time to just make sure they all connect together in space. Again, this is something that you can do without reference. Often when you're working from reference, you are just getting seduced by the forms themselves and not thinking about them in terms of the believability. And then you show your work to someone else and they go like, it looks like they're sat on the toilet, and you go, no, that's not what I wanted to convey. But you kind of lose sight of all of that big picture stuff as you get more and more pulled in with copying this form and copying that form. So here, there's a big disconnect there in the 3/4 view, and I don't need my reference to tell me whether or not my work is making sense. Because if someone can look at it and tell me that it's not, then that's all the information I need. Or if I can do that and know that it's not, that's all the information that I need, right? I might need my reference to tell me what the solution is. That's a slightly different thing. So here, I can look at this in the 3/4 view and go, there are some things broken through there. I might ask my reference how to fix it, but the important thing is that I look at it with that critical eye. Now, here's a nice cheat if you are both working digitally and working sculpturally, so that I can literally take volumes and see if they fit inside my sculpt, which of course, with any other medium is pretty much impossible. But of course, you can still take steps to ensure that what you're creating makes sense in the context of what it is that you're trying to create. So if it was a figure drawing, then you could just do an écorché drawing over the top, see if it all makes sense, see if it all is structurally sound. And this isn't so much about the accuracy of the thing, as much as it's just about helping me keep control of my work. For someone like me that, I do a lot of demonstrations, so I work very quickly. I have a tendency to rush my work. It also means I have a tendency to be quite lazy with my work. So then a step like this becomes very, very important. Just making sure that I've taken the time and the due diligence to make sure that everything is making sense in some sort of capacity. So I would even be doing this, if my work was super stylized, if I was really pushing things to an extreme, or maybe I'm doing a concept of the most grotesque creature imaginable. Well, it still needs to make sense. It still needs to be coherent. I mean, even more importantly, if it's a concept, if it's for a film or something like that, because then it's going to have to move. It's going to have to be animated and have life. So I need to really take the time to make sure that my work makes sense. And my reference won't necessarily tell me that, especially if I'm working from multiple different reference sources. Then maybe my work starts to become a Frankenstein collection of the different references, and I need to take a little bit of time to make sure that it is the thing that I need it to be or that I want it to be. Of course, if learning anatomy is a goal of yours, then this is incredibly useful for so many reasons, because now I have to think about creating some representational anatomy. So here I'm just worried about the iliac crest, the rising movement upwards and downwards and inwards of the hip bones, and then making sure that that all makes sense with my sculpt. So here I'm reinforcing my understanding of the bones whilst at the same time making sure that my sculpt makes volumetric sense. So basically this is telling me that I want to pull in the side of my model, but at the same time, this can be giving me the same trap that I've been trying to avoid when I've switched away from using reference, which is that I want to think about what the movement I want of my sculpt is, which is, a large portion of this movement is the rib cage pushing out that way and the hips pushing out in the opposing motion. So I want to do whatever I can to keep that movement and not sacrifice that if I can avoid it. And incidentally, when people are working with, contrapposto movement, which is where you have the hips going one way and the rib cage going another, everyone's always obsessing about the angles of them. But it's not just about the angles, it's about the shearing effect. It's about how much does one go to the right and how much does the other go to the left. And those two things go hand in hand. But for whatever reason, we almost never talk about that shearing effect, even though it's really important. The rib cage is this egg shape, kind of tapering at the top. So I'm using that as a guide to see where I should pull my sculpt in. But again, I'm doing this in the phase of not using reference. But like I say, there is a very real danger that I can just walk straight into a trap here, which is that I start just tracing around where I've blocked in these forms and stop using my brain, because I can just go around my sculpt and just start moving points until I can check that my sculpt is aligned with my bone everywhere where it should be. But then maybe I'm switching my brain off and not thinking about, is that the form that I want? Is the bone underneath actually the correct guide, or whatever it is that I need to be thinking about? So again, there is a wide open trap that is waiting for you every time when you have something that you can blindly follow. And it kind of switches off the part of your brain that is there to ask questions. Here, as one arm is dropped and the other arm pointing up, I'm thinking about the effect this has on the breasts. So this breast will be more relaxed and seem more full, and the other breast more stretched out. The whole time when I'm working without my reference, my guiding motivation, my guiding principle is what is the story that I'm looking to tell. And that will vary depending on which part of the sculpt it is that I'm working on. Is an area stretched? Is it compressed? Is it muscular? Is it bony? Here, remember this from the reference. I will probably go back to the reference to steal this more diligently, but just trying to capture the feeling of the ribs pushing out on the surface. Not because I think rib sculpting is cool, but because that tells the story of the stretch and the extension that's happening in this area. And then here, compression. When I think about compression, I think about like a stone, bonk, getting thrown into a pond, and I look at the ripple effect of that. So I'm looking at how the compression is affecting this area over here, even though it's not compressed enough to form an actual wrinkle. Back here, as the arm's getting pulled back, which is a thing that I've completely made up, so I haven't got reference for that yet. But for now, I'm just thinking, as it gets pulled back, there's compression here, there's extension there, so I'm just thinking about how to tell the story of those particular phenomena. So I remember from the reference those two really hard reads of the sternocleidomastoid, and I don't want to play with that. Actually, I think I want her looking that way. And you can tell the story of the way the head is looking very, very easily from telling the story of the sternocleidomastoid. So this one, that's tense. That means the head is looking to her left, our screen right. So I'm not going to find those two muscles to be equally intense. Instead, I'm going to find that one and then spin the head around, or spin the neck around. I could go quite comfortably for maybe a couple more hours without needing to switch back to reference, but here I've lucked out because I happen to teach anatomy and I'm working with a human figure. So if it was an area where I wasn't feeling so comfortable, and of course I couldn't sit here for so long. There's a lot of stories that I'm able to tell here just because I have a good expectation of what I think the form would be. But these patterns that I'm taking, so for example here as I work the sternum, I'm conscious that generally on a female with this sort of body type, we find like 2 or 3 ribs coming away from the sternum. So you'd find something that reads a little bit like that, which I think about as being as like cat whiskers, right? So there's that, and then there's this kind of comma or inverted number 6 there. That's kind of the mass of the fat of the breast and the mammary gland as it feeds through into the pectoralis major, and then a thickening of the wall here, which is the pectoralis minor. Now, all of that stuff is not particularly relevant information for this demonstration, but the point that I'm getting to is that I can only know those forms if I've consciously chosen to take them at some point. Right, whether it's as a student or as a teacher, whatever it is, those are things that I've internalized. Before, I was sculpting in some fat here at the side of the breast, which you see on some men, you see on some women. But when I was studying some of Frank Frazetta's work, I noticed he used that, separated the fat there from the pec there, to make his impossibly large breasts feel, not his impossibly large breasts, the impossibly large breasts that he was depicting feel naturalistic rather than fake. And so it was kind of in the middle of the reference sandwich that I was able to capture that, because when I'm just copying from him, then I'm just copying his forms. But when I stop working directly from his work and I ask myself, why would this be like that? Why would he take that? Which I do when I'm not looking at his work, that's when I can start to take it. So all of these movements that I'm looking for here are all things that I've consciously stolen at some point. You know, I could have copied from life 1,000 times, 100,000 times, and maybe never stolen those things, because you just get caught in that kind of copying mindset. So what I'm doing here is a mixture of 2 things. One is shape recollection, basically relying on a visual library that you've consciously built and then re-recording those shapes. And the other is, let's say, something like mindful storytelling, right? I'm thinking about what it is that I want to convey and whether it's tension, muscle compression, muscle extension, fat compression, a bony landmark, whatever it is. And then thinking, how do I tell that story? That doesn't require shape recollection necessarily. It's just thinking, how do I use the medium that I'm using, whether it's clay, whether it's digital sculpting, painting, whatever it is, to depict that story. So two different things, right? Shape recollection and conscious storytelling or mindful storytelling. And those are 2 things that you really don't need your reference for, but the reference is important to help you build up your library or reference of other artists to see how they have consciously told their stories, and then you steal them. But when I say steal, of course, by the time you use them in your own work, they get pushed through the filter of the way that you see in the world, and it doesn't become theft anymore. It just becomes your own way of working with form. I'm going to switch back to the final part of the sandwich. And of course, when I say final part, it's according to the concept that I'm talking about, which is where we start with reference and then we lose it, which is where I'm at now, and then we bring it back. In reality, you might go through this 5, 10, 1,000 times. It doesn't really matter, but the important thing is you're cultivating a mindset of going backwards and forwards from reference and not from reference, and thereby strengthening both what you're taking from nature and what you're giving to your artwork, and appreciating the importance of both of those things. What I'm going to do here, though, is a little bit different. I'm going to jump back to a different reference, because in the process of doing this, I have now decided more or less what my art piece is going to be. And this has deviated from the reference scan that we started out with. So potentially I need different reference to finish it off. In the course of creating whatever it is you're creating, you could ultimately be using 100 different sources of reference, and that's totally fine. Of course it is, but the idea is still the same. The idea is still to reinforce the fact that you are the one in control, you are the one in charge, and you take from reference to take what you need. So in the process of doing this, I was put in mind of a piece of work done by a friend of mine who was also a student at the Florence Academy of Art and is now director at the Florence Academy of Art. And that's Mitch Shea. And this, I can bring it up, is a piece of work that he did as a student. There is a degree of similarity both in the model and in the pose. So I'm going, okay, well maybe there's stuff that I can take from here. But if I do, what I need to be super aware of is what happens when I'm working from reference of another artist, because we've spoken about the pull of nature, but really it's the pull of whatever you're using as reference. And personally, I recommend that you use nature as much as you can because it gives you a purer reference point. But of course, you're going to want to see what other artists have done, see what you can take from them, and see, what you can use, anything you can use to strengthen your own work, of course. But here I'm conscious that Mitch's style is in some ways similar to mine. We both take forms, we both push them, we both find these kind of very kind of egg-shaped Michelangelo kind of movements as we can. And so in that way, we're not completely detached from each other, but at the same time, we're completely different people. And it's really important that if he's doing his work, he does it pure according to his way of working. And it's important that if I'm working, I do it pure according to my way of working. So the danger that you can get is as you're using another artist as a reference point, that your work starts to get contaminated with their approach to nature. And what I have with my students a lot is they're referencing not just one artist, but maybe 10 artists they like. And they don't just have one image, they have 10 images all over the place here. And that means that their work can sometimes get pulled and pushed around by 1,000 different voices that aren't theirs. And that's very, very dangerous. So remember, whatever happens here, I'm in control. As much respect as I have for Mitch here, when it comes to my own work, I'm the one who knocks. I'm going to be the one who makes decisions. And yet, there are things that even as I speak, I am stealing straight out of his hands. For example, as this arm gets pulled back, we lose the definition here as the skin and the flesh gets compressed. Now, I would probably encounter the exact same thing if I was just looking at this in a model and I was putting the model in the same pose. So in this case, it's not a direct steal from Mitch, potentially. So what I need to be aware of is where he has adapted what he's seen in nature, and then do I want to make the same adaptation or not? So for example, like this scapula up here, I'm sure that there were things there that were very, very similar. So this top line there, for example, that's going to be the line of the rhomboids. So I know what's creating that. I believe that that would exist in real life, and it's an interesting movement to find. I also suspect that these movements on the scapula existed, but were more subdued. So if I just take them and make them exactly like Mitch made them, and elsewhere I haven't taken Mitch's style, then what we get is a Frankenstein, right? Because we've got Mitchiness here and Chrisiness somewhere else. That can end up being very, very corrosive, especially if you have, a spot of Mitch, a spot of Chris, a spot of Valentina, a spot of whoever, then the artwork deviates from having any sense of purity. So of course, reference other artists. Just be very aware. Whether it's another artist, whether it's nature, whatever it is, they will have a pull. And you just need to be very conscious of that, very aware of it. As soon as that pull gets too strong, it's time to kick the reference away again. And then the sandwich repeats. It becomes a multi-layered sandwich. You can have as many pieces of filling, as many pieces of bread as you want. So, I could ultimately be referencing 10, 20, 100 different artists in the process of creating my work if that felt like it was a necessary thing. But the whole time, I'm respecting myself and my own guiding principle. Really like this fold here. I like the way that this other fold comes out underneath. And when I'm working with the body, my students will know I talk a lot about unexpected details. The things that the anatomy books don't show, don't teach you, but carry story with them, carry description. And this fold certainly fits into that category. So it means that you're not creating work that feels anatomical, but rather work that feels naturalistic. really liking how Mitch has got the separation of the scapula from the rib cage here. And at any time I could choose to jump back to my original reference to see how that looked in my original reference. And in fact, why don't I do that now? So now I'm working with multiple pieces of reference on my screen, and that's fine. That's normal, right? That's not an unusual thing. And in fact, oftentimes I'll have students with like 50 different kinds of reference, and then I go, maybe just the one. As long as I maintain that I am the guiding force behind the creation of this, I can have 10 types of different reference on my screen at any one time, and that's absolutely fine. But you may find yourself going in circles as you pick a bit from that, and then a bit from that, and then a bit from that, and you just redo the same area because your references are saying different things, and you need to be the glue that holds all of that together. And I also need to be aware of where my references differ from what I've got. So here, my movement is mostly side to side, right? That versus that, which is what was happening in our original pose reference there. In Mitch's sculpture, there is also a twist. And so that is adding even more compression through there. So if I take that twisted level of compression, then I'm telling a story that isn't happening here. So because of that, maybe it makes more sense that I reference this for my wrinkles. Maybe it makes sense that I reference neither because I've created my own pose. Well, then I better make sure that I've got a strong enough visual library to make it what I want it to be. In this case, both of my references are telling me something that I'm missing. And so if all my references agree that I'm missing something, then I should probably listen to them. Just looking at this outer contour through there. When you have a raised arm, you can get some really beautiful movements moving down the outside. You can see on this arm, the movements are a little bit more subdued. On Mitch's, because of this kind of mannered style of working with the anatomy, you get lots of in-out movements, which I like as well, right? We have the deltoid pushing out, and then this would be the infraspinatus, or potentially latissimus. And then this would be latissimus and teres major pushing out, and that's serratus, and that's rib cage, and you're just getting a lot of little bumps, and it's a very exciting movement if you like that sort of movement. Now I'm on my own because I don't have a front view of Mitch's, and I've deviated pretty significantly from my reference here. But I do kind of like this. This movement, I would say, again, is a kind of unexpected detail that might just help me find a little bit more naturalism. I've pushed the pose so far that I'm going to be very lucky if I happen to find a way to make this feel believable and naturalistic. I've got her looking to the left and Mitch's is looking to the right, so that means I shouldn't be using any of that as reference. She's looking to her right as well, so again, I'm on my own here unless I decide to find appropriate reference for that. Now I'm jumping between using the reference and not using the reference. There are a whole bunch of things that I'll be looking for here that I wouldn't have been looking for if I hadn't initially stolen them from reference at some point, and then they later formed part of my visual library. So, for example, as I'm just going into the side view and just making sure that that sternocleidomastoid tendon is as straight as it can be, that's because I know that if I really want to tell the story of tendon, then I want to find the straightness of it. And that's going to be how I tell the story of a head turning. So at some point I needed reference for that, and then I stole it from my visual library, and now maybe I don't so much. I like the sharpness of that point of the aces there. Boom, really sharp. And then what you tend to see more in women than in men is the leg plugging in a little bit lower than that. So in this way, I'm both taking from reference and also adding in what I know of the anatomy. Here, back to taking from reference, just finding that curve of the buttocks. And maybe this dimple is going to tell me about that bum being tense. Yeah, because I have stumbled across quite a cartoony set of bum cheeks here. So should I reduce that? Probably. That's thick with 3 C's. Okay, I think there's an interesting thing that's happening here, which is the more naturalism I bring to there, the more ridiculous my cartoon bum is becoming. I mean, I have a reference point for her bum, which has a really strong angle to it. It's very nice, it's very feminine. So, it might be that the sensible thing is to go, okay, let's pull back to the reference. Or it could be that I would have thought it was working fine if I didn't have the reference there to pull me in another direction. So I actually don't know. At the end, I might need to take in like a Kardashian style bum to give me reference for these sorts of hips, right? This kind of gluteal mass and this width of the hips. This could be an example of where my reference is then starting to make me tame my forms again, and starting to make me make forms that are a little bit too cautious. I've just looked at this movement and I don't like it. And I can find my own way of breaking it because I know that this is the scapula, this is the rhomboid. It doesn't make sense to have that so long and unbroken. But my scapula is deviated from the reference scapula, and it deviated as I was then working from Mitch's sculpt here. So what I'm going to do is jump back to this, and then it's about asking the questions, right? Whenever you're working from nature or from reference, it's always about knowing which questions to ask. So I know I don't like that long solid line because I'm using one line to describe two very different forms. Bone with muscle on top, and then just muscle getting pulled out straight. So I need to be conscious of different ways to describe that. So then as I go to my reference, I'm literally asking the question in my head, all right, how did you do it? How are you breaking it? So there's this little triangle here. There are some interesting movements, this egg shape there. It's a nice little unexpected detail. And then again, some of this kind of rippling tension through here. Don't think is going to do any harm. Now I'm starting to find some of these knobbly little movements. I'm very wary of this because as I do it, I know that's a kind of Mitchism. And so I know that if I do that in one place without doing it in other places, then I'm going to create a contamination. It's going to be a horrific Mitch Chris kind of baby hybrid that would probably need burning with fire. So let's try and avoid that. And then at this point, I could potentially throw the reference away again if I wanted to, and make sure that I'm making my own thing again. So the point here was that I had a specific problem that I wanted to solve, and the way that I chose to solve it was to look at reference and then ask the question, all right, how did you do it? But then at some point it might be appropriate for me to then figure out what it is that I want from the form. A quick example of the reference sandwich, right? I knew there was a problem without reference. I went to reference. I used it to address the problem. I threw the reference away, and now I'm working into it again. So that's it. I probably spent about an hour after the demonstration finishing up the sculpt, but you don't need to see that. It's just the same. You go backwards and forwards, using reference and not using reference and whatever. But one thing that I think is worth clarifying, it's a whole other subject, but I just want to touch on it. When I'm talking about going backwards and forwards, it's with an idea of incrementally working my way up towards a finish. If you find yourself going around in a circle, or you're literally just going backwards and forwards, making the same changes, that's something else. It's normally a sign that you don't have a motivating impulse. That is, you're trying to make things interesting or cool rather than making them all what they are. If you remember the Philip video, we need to make Philip as Philippy as he can be. If we start to try and make him interesting, then we can get lost very quickly. So if you find yourself hitting that dreaded circle, be decisive. Make a strong, hard decision, and that will often break your way out of it. One thing that struck me as I was doing this demonstration, and I comment on it in the demonstration, was I was a bit like, yeah, this is going to be a bit harder if you don't know the anatomy. And of course, that's its whole thing as well. But then I got to thinking about it, I was like, it's not so different. When I started studying anatomy, I got Paul Richard's Autistic Anatomy, which is still the main book that I would recommend, and copied every single drawing out of it as accurately as I could. And that didn't really make my anatomy skill any better because I was falling into the same trap as in the reference sandwich. I was a slave to those anatomy drawings, and it was only when I stood back and started to go, okay, how do I use this to benefit myself as an artist, that I became able to use it in a much more powerful and in a much more fluid way. And that's something that I've thought a lot about over the years. And the course that I'm developing with Proko at the moment is specifically to look at that. How do we as artists use anatomy in a way that gives us absolute creative freedom? In the meantime, you can find more videos from me on the ScreenClayFX YouTube channel or on the ScreenClayFX website. It's the same stuff. So you can find videos there covering anatomy and design and whatever else. The latest project that I've done using the reference sandwich in a live production environment is called Outside the Wire. That's on Netflix now. And that was an interesting one for me because it's set in a relatively near future. The look the director wanted for the robots was very much kind of Boston Dynamics. So the sandwich is kind of obvious. I go and study Boston Dynamics solidly, lots of drawings of that. Then I throw it away, do my designs, and then bring it in again to see what I'm missing, to embed those designs back into the real world. If you want to study with me in person, you can find me at the CG Masters Academy, or you can find me at the Barcelona Academy of Art. But that's everything. Nothing more for me to say other than thank you so much to Proko and team for giving me this platform, for making the world a better place for artists to be. And I will see you guys at some point in the future.
Thanks, Christian. Now that you guys have seen that the reference sandwich method can be applied to anything, you may want to test it out for yourself. And what better place to show off your results than a website crafted with Squarespace? Squarespace makes it easy to build a site that looks stunning with very little effort and technical knowledge. Not only will you have a place to display your art, but with their integrated commenting system, you'll be able to create a community as well. Visitors on your site can leave threaded comments, replies, and likes to drive discussion about your art. On top of all that, you can connect your social media accounts, display posts from your social profiles on your website, and automatically push website content to your favorite social media platforms so your followers can share it too. Understanding how your audience engages with your website is important to help drive growth. And Squarespace gives you an analytics dashboard to help you do just that. Analyzing data is not something artists like to do, but Squarespace makes it easy with data on traffic sources, audience geography, how much time visitors spend on your site, and much more. Don't just rely on social media to drive attention to your work. Build something that you can control. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Proko to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.